Donald Trump has just delivered the most forceful trade ultimatum ever seen in the entire history of U.S.-Canada relations. This wasn't a gentle warning or an opening for talks. It was a flat-out ultimatum. A current American president turned to the North and informed one of America's longest-standing allies, the country sharing the planet's longest undefended border, that it must comply or face complete economic devastation. Mark Carney, Canada's newly appointed prime minister and a former central banker who steered major institutions through two of the most severe financial storms of recent decades, didn't hesitate for even a moment. What unfolded over the next 72 hours after that ultimatum should concern every American who values constitutional principles, economic steadiness, and respect for treaty obligations. This goes far beyond tariffs. It raises the question of whether the United States still stands behind the agreements it signs. It asks whether a president can unilaterally scrap a trade deal he himself negotiated and proudly promoted without facing any repercussions. When the head of a G7 country openly states that the previous partnership is finished, it signals a profound and irreversible change. Hit subscribe right now because you won't want to miss any updates I post on this developing situation. This is only the start. So what actually triggered this dramatic clash? On February 24, 2026, at roughly 6:15 a.m., Donald Trump published a message on Truth Social. There was no scheduled press conference, no prior heads up to Congress, no coordination with the U.S. Trade Representative, just a single social media announcement sent out before most people in official Washington had finished their morning coffee. The post declared that Canada would be hit with a 35% tariff on every good exported to the U.S., not the 25% discussed in earlier weeks, but 35%. Set to begin in 14 days unless Ottawa accepted a set of demands that people close to the talks called intentionally extreme and clearly meant to embarrass. This is not merely another partisan argument. It is a genuine constitutional and economic emergency playing out live. And when Canada's Prime Minister answers the way Mark Carney answered, you can be certain something massive has just erupted within the North American economic framework. Here is the complete sequence of events that has been taking shape. Friction between Washington and Ottawa had been steadily increasing since December 2025, driven by Trump's frequent comments suggesting Canada ought to think about joining the United States as the 51st state. Canadian leaders first dismissed those remarks as exaggeration, but the tone became more worrisome as Trump's advisors began quietly urging Canadian diplomats to quit rejecting the concept in public. Several people familiar with those exchanges said the private diplomatic atmosphere had turned sharply negative by the middle of January. The situation exploded further on February 17, 2026, when a high-ranking White House economic advisor delivered an off-the-record session to a group of Washington reporters. According to coverage in the Globe and Mail and the Washington Post, that session laid out, in stark language, the administration's new tariff approach. The leaked notes of the briefing, which spread among parliamentary aides in Ottawa within 2 days, included wording that insiders called deliberately inflammatory. This was never really about fixing trade imbalances. It was about forcing compliance. Carney's administration grasped the intent right away. And this is where matters turned truly grave. On February 19th, after Carney's economic advisors studied the leaked briefing notes, they held what multiple insiders described as an intensive 6-hour simulation exercise in the basement of the Langevin block, the building next to the House of Commons that houses the Prime Minister's office. Attendees included the Finance Minister, the Bank of Canada Governor, top trade lawyers from Global Affairs Canada, and, drawing particular notice in Ottawa, 2 ex-senior IMF officials who had collaborated with Carney during his time running the Bank of England. This was not a last-minute panic. It was a pre-planned response structure putting a contingency strategy, evidently prepared over several weeks, into motion. Here is what people with knowledge of the events say occurred afterward. Early on the morning of February 24th, just minutes after Trump's Truth Social message appeared, Carney's chief of staff phoned the Prime Minister, who was already up. According to one government source in the room, the chief of staff told him the post matched exactly what they had expected. Carney immediately organized a cabinet-level conference call. The participants decided the reply must satisfy 3 requirements. It had to come quickly, it had to carry real economic weight, and it had to demonstrate to the entire world, not only Washington, that Canada was not reacting defensively. At the same time, by 7:45 a.m. that morning, Reuters was reporting that Canadian trade lawyers had started preparing official complaints for submission to the USMCA dispute settlement mechanism. By 9 a.m., staff at the Canadian Embassy in Washington had reached out to the offices of 22 U.S. senators from states heavily involved in trade with Canada, including Michigan, Minnesota, Montana, and Ohio, to explain the likely economic fallout before Carney delivered his public remarks. Capitol Hill sources verified that those conversations took place. Several called the briefings exceptionally thorough and skillfully handled. Now comes the truly dramatic moment. At 11 a.m. Eastern Time on February 24th, Mark Carney stepped in front of the cameras outside Rideau Cottage in Ottawa. No teleprompter in sight, no visible notes. He stood at the lectern with the calm bearing of someone, as one person watching put it, who had been anticipating precisely this confrontation. Carney opened his remarks without any introduction. His tone remained steady, his delivery measured. "The United States has delivered an ultimatum," Carney stated. "We do not respond to ultimatums. Canada is not a dependent territory. We are an independent country, a charter member of NATO, a treaty ally, and the United States' single largest trading partner." The press corps in Ottawa went completely quiet. "As of this moment," Carney went on, "Canada is launching a comprehensive examination of all export authorizations for critical minerals headed to the United States, including cobalt, lithium, and rare earth elements vital to American defense production. We are also imposing immediate mirror tariffs of 35% on every category of American consumer products. And we are formally activating Chapter 31 of the USMCA to contest the legal validity of these tariffs in front of an international arbitration panel." Reporters edged closer. A few Canadian officials standing behind him traded quick looks. "The United States will discover," Carney continued, pausing exactly 3 seconds, "that threatening Canada carries consequences." That single line, "threatening Canada carries consequences," rippled through Washington in a matter of minutes. The statement flashed across financial screens instantly. U.S. carmakers reliant on Canadian parts watched their stock prices fall 3.7% during the first hour of trading after the speech. Midwestern energy shares started declining. The S&P 500 dropped 94 points by midday. Subscribe right away if you haven't already. This coverage isn't available anywhere else. This isn't the first occasion a U.S. president has pushed too hard on trade with a key partner and paid a price. Recall Ronald Reagan's trade battles with Japan during the 1980s. Semiconductor tariffs prompted coordinated countermeasures and eventually led to a negotiated settlement on U.S. terms, but only after considerable strain on the alliance. Reagan came to recognize that economic partners are not subordinates. The disagreement concluded through negotiation, not coercion. Then came George W. Bush's 2002 steel tariffs. Bush applied wide-ranging duties on imported steel, hoping to shield American jobs in battleground states before midterms. The European Union, Canada, and Japan swiftly threatened counter tariffs aimed at politically sensitive U.S. exports: Florida citrus, Michigan steel, California wine. In less than 19 months, Bush withdrew the tariffs completely. The WTO ruled against the United States. The takeaway was unmistakable. The critical distinction now is that Trump has deployed these measures not as conventional trade policy, but as a tool of political pressure within a relationship governed by a treaty he himself negotiated and celebrated. The USMCA, which Trump signed with great ceremony in January 2020 and frequently called the best trade agreement ever, includes precise rules for any tariff changes. Numerous legal specialists have stated that the February 24th action seems to breach those rules outright. Jonathan Freed, a former Canadian ambassador to the WTO and OECD, told Global News this represents an unprecedented case, a treaty signatory attempting to use emergency tariff authority that the treaty itself limits. He pointed out that Canada's choice to trigger Chapter 31 was carefully designed to place that exact legal issue before an international tribunal where U.S. domestic politics hold no influence. Stick around, the most startling section is still ahead. What should truly worry every American following this is that Trump's ultimatum did more than harm a commercial partnership. It may have activated a legal process capable of constraining future U.S. administrations in ways that remain only partially understood. Once international trade dispute panels are engaged, they follow fixed schedules and procedures that no president, regardless of party, can simply cancel with a social media update. Canada understands this. Carney's team understands this. The real question is whether anyone in the West Wing grasped it prior to February 24. This leaves the Trump administration in an extraordinarily difficult spot. On one hand, retreating now, canceling the tariffs, or opening talks would mean publicly admitting the ultimatum collapsed, which directly contradicts the narrative of economic dominance sold to Trump supporters. On the other hand, moving forward with the 35% tariffs would unleash a series of outcomes that several observers describe as potentially self-destructive. Canadian counter tariffs on U.S. consumer products, Canadian controls on critical mineral shipments vital to American defense and tech industries, a formal legal case before an international panel that could drag on for 12 to 18 months, and a severe cooling effect on investment in U.S. sectors tied to Canadian supply chains. There is no painless way out. And here is the troubling aspect. There appears to be no solid justification. Either Trump's advisors completely misjudged Canada's reaction, an astonishing lapse in elementary foreign policy assessment, or they anticipated it, recognized the risks, and pushed ahead regardless, which prompts far more disturbing questions about their intended outcome. Legal and political observers are labeling this a pivotal shift in North American ties. Ian Lee, a business professor at Carleton University's Sprott School, told CBC's Power and Politics that what stands out about Carney's reply is the remarkable speed and precision with which it turned economic retaliation into action, something Washington evidently failed to foresee. He noted that launching the critical minerals export review fundamentally altered the dynamic by forcing American defense contractors, not merely automakers, to contact their members of Congress. Even certain voices on the American right have recognized the gravity. The Wall Street Journal editorial board, traditionally supportive of Trump's economic nationalist stance, ran an article on the morning of February 25th, calling the escalation a self-inflicted injury and asking whether the administration had any coherent plan for resolution. So let's outline the actual implications. First, the short-term economic fallout. American consumers will start noticing Canadian counter tariffs within 30 to 60 days. Canada remains the top foreign source of consumer goods to the U.S. Midwest, including lumber, dairy, steel, and energy. Canadian authorities have confirmed the reciprocal tariff schedule was deliberately aimed at products made and sold in states that backed Trump in 2024: Pennsylvania, Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin. This is retaliation crafted with surgical political accuracy. Second, the national security and technology vulnerability. Canada supplies the majority of cobalt and lithium used in U.S. electric vehicle batteries and in components for American military hardware. Even the announcement of a formal export review, well before any actual permit cancellations, generates uncertainty that defense firms cannot disregard. Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, and Raytheon all rely on Canadian origin minerals in their supply chains. Congressional aides from both parties told Politico on February 25th that defense industry lobbying organizations had already begun contacting the Armed Services Committees. Third, the treaty precedent. Should the USMCA dispute panel rule against the United States, and many trade law specialists consider that the probable outcome given the procedural steps Trump skipped, it would establish a binding legal standard that restricts American tariff powers under the current agreement. That would leave any future administration attempting to rely on the USMCA for predictable trade relations operating in a weakened legal landscape shaped by this episode. This extends beyond Trump. It shapes what follows. But beyond the immediate economic and legal damage, this concerns something deeper. It concerns whether the United States government upholds its treaty promises. The USMCA passed Congress and was signed into law. It carries the full force of American legal duty. When a president takes steps that legal authorities say violate the treaty's explicit terms, the damage is not limited to one bilateral relationship. It broadcasts to every country that has ever concluded an agreement with the United States a message about the real value of those commitments. This has created authentic unease inside parts of the Republican foreign policy community. Multiple sources on the Hill report that the Senate Commerce Committee held a closed-door meeting on February 25th with both Republican and Democratic members present, during which senior trade officials faced sharp questions about the administration's legal basis for the tariffs. People familiar with the discussion describe the mood as strained and the responses as inadequate. At the same time, American manufacturing and farming organizations remain sharply split. Some have offered tentative backing for the tariff plan. Others, including the American Farm Bureau, which speaks for farmers throughout the agricultural Midwest, issued a statement on February 24th voicing deep concern over Canadian countermeasures that could harm U.S. grain and livestock exports. Canada ranks as the second largest buyer of American farm products. The Farm Bureau did not call it a catastrophe. It called it alarming. In Washington, when the Farm Bureau uses the word alarming, lawmakers in both parties pay close attention. Stay with me. What follows will fundamentally shift your perspective on this entire matter. Here is what makes the situation even more remarkable. Trump replied to Carney's statement at 3:17 p.m. on February 24th with a Truth Social post that labeled Carney's response a feeble and desperate ploy by someone elected only 2 weeks earlier who pretends to grasp economics. Trump asserted Carney was bluffing. He predicted Canada would be back at the negotiating table within 72 hours. He accused Canadian media of, in his phrasing, cheering the ruin of their own nation. Carney's office released no additional public comment. They didn't need to. The markets had already delivered the rebuttal. Legal specialists quickly highlighted the flaw in Trump's approach. When your public answer to a serious economic and legal countermove is to brush it off as a bluff and attack the person rather than engage the substance, you have not refuted the argument. You have admitted you cannot refute it. This has moved well beyond a commercial disagreement. It now concerns whether the constitutional structure that oversees international treaty duties still serves as a genuine limit on executive power. If a president can single-handedly dismantle a trade agreement he personally endorsed, sidestepping Congress, sidestepping the USTR, sidestepping the legal mechanisms the agreement itself establishes, then the issue is no longer Canada. The issue becomes what any future American treaty obligation is actually worth. If this action carries no consequences, if the tariffs go forward, if the legal challenge is disregarded, if Congress fails to intervene, it tells every nation with a trade or security pact with the United States that American promises depend entirely on the temperament of whoever occupies the presidency at any given time. That is not trade policy. That is the collapse of American reliability as a treaty partner. If this realization hits you as hard as it should, hit the like button right now. Here is where matters stand today. Canada has formally launched a legal challenge under the USMCA. Critical mineral export authorizations are under active review. Reciprocal 35% tariffs on American consumer goods are now active. The USMCA dispute process includes a required 30-day consultation phase before formal hearings begin, so a decision is unlikely before mid-spring at the soonest. Congressional Republicans from states with heavy Canadian trade links are quietly discussing with White House officials whether the tariff rate can be lowered before the political damage becomes permanent. Mark Carney has set a March 3rd address to the Canadian Parliament, where sources indicate he will unveil further steps. The European Union has voiced support for Canada's legal stance. Japan and South Korea, both maintaining trade arrangements with the United States that include provisions comparable to those in the USMCA, are monitoring this case closely. Watch March 3rd carefully. Watch the developments inside the Senate Commerce Committee corridors. Watch the critical minerals export review. If Canada shifts from review to actual permit cancellations, the defense sector's reaction will be immediate and powerful, and it will reach Capitol Hill with significant force. Here is the current reality. The President of the United States issued an ultimatum to Canada. Canada delivered a countermove that was quicker, more legally precise, and more economically targeted than anyone in the Trump administration evidently expected. The economic effects are already appearing in U.S. markets, the legal effects are progressing in real time, and the institutional effects for American treaty credibility, for the stability of the USMCA structure, for the balance between executive decisions and congressional trade oversight, may prove the longest-lasting harm. This is not simply another news story. This is a constitutional and economic turning point unfolding before our eyes. The events of the next 30 to 60 days could decide whether the United States-Canada relationship can recover before it permanently alters North American trade and security arrangements. And the precedent now being established, whether a president can discard his own treaty without consequence, will endure long after this administration, whatever the outcome. The facts are in the open. The legal challenge is underway. The countermeasures are active. Now we wait to learn whether accountability still matters in Washington. The stakes are unprecedented. The legal vulnerability is unmistakable. And the cost of mishandling this moment has never been more immediate.